preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
The Radius Institute, whose director is Stephen Shaw, is happy to sponsor this second of 4 evenings, together with the help of the National Jewish Resource Center and with the special help of William and Pearl Hack and the Frank M. Morgenstern Foundation. Steve Shaw, who is unable to be with us this evening because he is ill, also wanted us to thank Sima Mittman of the 92nd Street Y for her help in organizing this series. Our format tonight will have our two speakers address the topic, then we will ask them to address each other, and also to be addressed by the audience through questions and perhaps brief comments. After that, we will hope to adjourn into the next room for coffee and refreshments, where you will be able to talk with or accost the speakers, depending on your attitude towards them. And you'll also be able to hear more of the comments from your distinguished moderator. I am Stephen Cohen. I am an associate professor of social psychology at the City University of New York, and I am happy to moderate between two very distinguished experts on this topic, both of whom have had a long history of experience in Israel-diaspora relations and in Israel-American Jewry relations, perhaps as part of the marriage in crisis, perhaps as marriage counselors. Our two speakers are first Leonard Fine on my left, who is the publisher, the editor-in-chief, and the main contributor to Moment magazine. Through well over 1,000 lectures and dozens of essays, he has expressed his views and indeed created a whole image of Israel-diaspora relations and Israel-American Jewry relations through his own thought and eloquent writing. He is one of those academics who has moved into an active role in Jewish life, formerly both at MIT and at Brandeis University, where he wrote academic works on these topics, and is now one of the foremost spokesmen for a particular view of Israel's relationship with American Jewry and vice versa. Our second speaker, on my right, is Fred Gottheil. Fred is professor of economics at the University of Illinois and is the national chairman of the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East, one of the most active organizations in talking about problems of Israel in the Middle East since the 1967 war. He was a visiting professor in the Hebrew University a number of times, and indeed has been a consultant at the White House on Middle Eastern affairs at times during the Carter administration. So we're very lucky to have two such distinguished speakers. I'd like to take a moment out to perhaps lay the groundwork for what are the issues in Israel and American Jewry, a marriage in crisis. Israel-diaspora relations has become, over the last few years, a euphemism for discussing the relations between Israel and American Jewry. No other diaspora has achieved this prominence and importance. The issue of crisis seems to have come about partly because of the growth of importance of America to Israel's future, and partly because of the growth and importance of Israel and the Middle East to the American future. Furthermore, we have seen the growth of an articulate generation of American Jews who have come to political and Jewish maturity after the birth of Israel, and perhaps beyond the trauma of American Jewish irrelevance to European Jewish history and its demise. And we have seen also the growth of an Israeli generation beyond the founding of Israel and beyond its ideological pioneering consensus about the creation of the state into a state rife with many conflicts of a political and social nature. If this is the moment in which the crisis occurs, what are some of the issues that we will hope to hear about tonight? Some of them are internal Jewish issues. We have seen conflict on aspects of religious pluralism, the question of reform and conservative Judaism in Israel. We have seen conflict about the question of Soviet Jews in America. and some beginnings of discussion about the priorities of American Jewish community in terms of funding for projects in the United States or project in Israel. And we have seen a gradually growing cultural gap as Israel becomes more and more a unique culture of its own, and American Jewry becomes an American Jewish culture, or an American culture, depending on one's point of view, more and more separate from that. But if there is a word crisis, perhaps it comes more from the external issues, the problems of foreign policy. Over the last few years, the question of American relationship to Israel has become more and more critical, both for Israel and for American Jewry. And the question of the wisdom of Israeli government policy in relationship to issues of the Middle East, and what role American Jews should play in articulating their views about this, has become an issue of some concern. Perhaps that's why the crisis occurs. The relationship may be a marriage, and if so, maybe it's a marriage that is suffering the problems of having been a marriage of a shadchan. That is, the two members of the couple perhaps did not know each other before the marriage. Now that they are getting to know each other, the problems of a real relationship are emerging. Our first speaker then is Fred Gottheil, the director of the American Professors for Peace in the Middle East.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me conclude before I start. I think the marriage is workable and is working. Like every marriage, there are moments of tension, but don't mistake tension for drift or crises. After saying this, let me acknowledge a built-in problem in this marriage that most marriages don't have. It is, I think, a non-resolvable dilemma, a Jewish dilemma, and it is the very existence of Israel itself. That existence creates a problem within the diaspora. It raises the most fundamental question, which is, why am I here? The concept of Israel is central to our Jewish existence. It always was. We were a wandering people. We were a nation without a geography. And as a nation tied together, not only by external forces imposed upon us, discrimination, intolerance, crumbs, so on, but an internal cohesion which ran over thousands of years to annoy the hell out of Arnold Toynbee, who says, these people are fossils, why don't they behave as a fossil? We are a people, and finally, we had a geography. And the real question is, what are we doing in Buffalo, New York? Now, this is an issue that doesn't just face us now as the nation state came into existence. We should remember that in the great migrations from Western and Eastern Europe at the turn of the century and into the 19-teens and 20s, over 95% of Jews came to the New World. Only 5%, roughly 5%, went then to Palestine. It's a story that has a long history. Even when we consider the Aliyah, the second Aliyah, the Aliyah of our founders, of the nation state, the Jewish community, approximately half left themselves. So that it is not only a question we ask now, but we know this question keeps recurring in the history of that relationship between the Jewish people in the diaspora and the Jewish people then in Palestine and now in Israel. Now, this marriage that I talk about in terms of being a good and workable marriage still is a marriage among a small set of our people. Not everyone is involved in Jewish affairs. Now, in terms of crises, of course, we do get a much more representative voice of the Jewish community. But consciously, it's a small set of Jews that ask the questions and deal with these difficult problems. And they are a remarkable people, these small set of Jews. Their interests range from the American Jewish establishment to Zionist radicals, from religious people to non-religious people, rich people and poor people, but all Jews interested in Jewish life. They share one important value, a personal obligation to their fellow Jews. I don't know how I could overstate this incredible quality about them. This small band represent what we could call the Jewish lobby. It is a remarkable lobby because it's the only lobby I know of that is not self-serving. The oil lobby is interested in oil profits, and the steel lobby in steel profits, and we go through all the lobbies, both at the federal, state, and local levels, both at your communities, dealing with issues that may not even be economic related, but they're all self-serving. The tie that binds us all together is a tie that doesn't bring profits to us, but heartache at times, and it's costly. Israel is sometimes referred to as a nation of 3 million people with 12 million taxpayers. It is true, and it is a point of honor and a point of much substance. To the basic question still, is the marriage in crisis? I think not. I think this set of Jews, over the course of a number of years, has been growing. The bonds are strengthening, not weakening. Now, we get mixed signals. We read today's headlines, and today's headlines tomorrow are yesterday's headlines, and new forces, new events take place. And we are a troubled, nervous people, and we respond to these daily events. We respond to the short run. As Keynes once said, we better because in the long run we're all dead. But nonetheless, we should give a historical perspective to this question. And if you look over the course of years in terms of the Jewish commitment to Israel and to itself in a diaspora, I think we have reason to be optimistic. In spite, as I said, of some of these signals we read today. Let me talk now about these signals that give us some reason to pause. There are essentially three. The first is the external environment. We are dealing today with, for lack of a better word, I put a non-friendly, some people would call it a hostile environment, external environment. Israel is portrayed in the media by the administration as belligerent, stubborn, so that when you pick up a newspaper, as I did 2 days ago, to read about the Christian Lebanese shelling Palestinian villages in Lebanon, the headline reads, Israeli-backed troops shell Palestinian villages. The impression is there. It doesn't say Christians shell Soviet-backed villages. That's not how it reads. You read that, and I read that, and you feel nervous. You feel that somehow there is a wedge being driven into this relationship between ourselves as American Jews in the diaspora and those things that take place in Israel, an uncertainty, an uneasiness about an event that occurs there. It's external to our own world. But daily, through Walter Cronkite and his colleagues, and through the events that take place, there is this image that we confront. And it is a critical one that weighs in on our own perception of our marriage. There is a second, which I've alluded to before, a second problem, and that is that the state is there, and why are we here? something like O'Neill's "The Iceman Cometh," O'Neill, and finally the Iceman came. And now it's a realization. Exactly what do we do? It is a dilemma. So it's not just the outside world that comes in on us and creates an uneasiness. It's our own feeling of our roots that somehow are driven in two directions. And then there is, thirdly, the question, the very real question, of Israel's behavior with respect to events in the Middle East and events in Israel itself. We read these things and ask ourselves, are these policies that represent our own feeling as Jews in the diaspora? If they are, how do I express myself? If they're not, how do I express myself? So these three things are constantly confronting the Jewish community not in Israel. Well, let me talk now about this third problem about Israel's policies. Remember, we are a people descended from the prophets. And while the prophets may have been right, don't forget they were also very few and non-representative. My argument is contemporary. I believe that our contemporary prophets on the issues are dead wrong. And that's what brings me here tonight. I don't deny their objectives, which I share. I am totally convinced that we are all, as Jews in this community, concerned, passionately involved in the promotion of Jewish ideals and the health of the state of Israel. There's no question here. Okay? Nor do I deny an American Jew's right to speak out in criticism. I reserve that right for myself. But I believe the criticism is ill-conceived. Moreover, I believe the criticism is not only wrong because of the external circumstances I've alluded to before, but that it is totally self-defeating. It feeds a well-defined anti-Israeli bias already existing in this country. It feeds a growing uncertainty among well-intentioned Jewish leaders and lay people. It feeds an erroneous image of ourselves. But let me make this point, as Nixon said, absolutely clear. Were the criticism valid, were the criticism of Israel valid, I would not hesitate to pursue it publicly, whatever the consequences I've just described, simply because the material and moral health of Israel is more important to me than the protection of abuse that may be placed upon Israel in the short run. And I believe that those who differ with me in terms of our assessment of Israeli policy would agree for ourselves the penalties imposed upon those who have more than enough caused hardship and war to our people. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Leonard Fine.
There's a story that I've told more times than I care to remember, and I hadn't planned to tell it this evening, but it seems to me that its propriety is so manifest that I ought to succumb to the temptation. The story is that which is told about the decision by the British government some years back to build a tunnel underneath the English Channel. And some of you may remember that the project was indeed planned and had proceeded quite a distance into the operational stage before Britain came upon hard times and had to cancel it. But during its planning period, bids were invited for the construction of the tunnel, and a number of bids were received in response. One was from Her Majesty's Royal Engineers Limited. It was a bid for £750 million. There was a bid from an American firm called Tunnels Incorporated for 743 million pounds. There were another half dozen or so bids in that same general ballpark. And then along came one bid from a firm called Cohen and Goldberg for 10,000 pounds. The authorities could not understand such a low bid, but the law required that they respond to the lowest bidder. There being no telephone listing for the firm of Cohen and Goldberg, they went off to the return address shown on the envelope, which turned out to be a fifth-floor walk-up in the East End of London, a little cubicle of an office with just room enough for one desk. There sat Cohen. Goldberg was on the road. And they said, Mr. Cohen? He said the same. They said, we're here to talk with you about the tunnel. He said, oh, yes, the tunnel. They said, actually, sir, we're somewhat surprised by your bid. He said, surprised? What's to be surprised? They said, well, it's very low. He said, so low is good, no? They said, yes, low is good, sir, but frankly, we don't understand how for 10,000 pounds you could even begin to buy the equipment that's necessary to construct such an elaborate project as this. Equipment, he said? What equipment? 2 shovels. They said, with 2 shovels, you're going to dig a tunnel from here to France? How in the world do you propose to do that? He said, it's very simple. I'll start from England with a shovel. Goldberg will start from France with a shovel. When we meet, poof, you've got a tunnel. They said, that's crazy. That's insane. What if you never meet? He said, then you've got 2 tunnels. Later, perhaps, we will join more directly. I don't know who's responsible for the title of this evening's discourse, for the metaphor of marriage in that title, but it is a metaphor that I happily accept, since following Shakespeare, I do not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments, nor accept as love that which alters when it alteration finds. Love, the sonnet says, looks on tempests and is never shaken. That's the context of my remarks, for I firmly believe that we are bound to Israel in love, and it is only that which permits us to speak of the tempest. Ours is, it seems to me, indeed a marriage in crisis. What marriage is not? But ours is not a marriage whose troubles can be resolved by divorce, which is an entirely unthinkable prospect. It is therefore well to look at the crisis and to propose ways in which the marriage can be made more productive, more satisfying. I suspect that the choice of the title for this evening's conversation was meant to suggest the current political difficulties which Professor Gottheil spoke about, those which beset Israel, and which have divided in considerable measure our own community. I'll have a bit to say about those in a few minutes, but I begin from a rather different place. For it seems to me that the current political debate provides merely an inviting occasion for the expression of a discontent whose origins are far deeper and whose implications are far more disconcerting than sterile discussions of the legitimacy of dissent usually acknowledge. We are a marriage whose partners have, in very significant ways, disappointed one another. Neither of us has lived up to the other's somewhat romanticized expectations. Most obviously, the Israelis are centrally disappointed that we are here rather than there. But beyond that, it seems to me that the quality and the character of the American Jewish community, as they unfold, constitute a standing rebuke to Zionist theory and the existence of the American Jewish community in the form it has come to take is in no small measure a reproach to Zionist hopes. Zionist theory taught 3 things about diaspora life. First, the diaspora could not be physically safe for the Jews. Second, even if somehow the diaspora were physically safe for the Jews, it would inevitably be a cultural disaster. That is, if we were not destroyed by our ill-wishers, we would be destroyed by our well-wishers, by those who permitted us access to the open society, whose temptations we could not resist. Third, even if we managed somehow to escape the twin hazards of meanness and of kindness, we would be trapped by our own underlying sense of invalidity. Zion was, after all, not only the refuge of the Jewish people, it was the purpose of the Jewish people. To live elsewhere once Zion was established would be to deny that purpose. Now, for all the lurking suspicion that it can happen here, there is, it seems to me, simply no sound reason to believe, save for a drearily repetitious history, that it is likely to happen here. Indeed, there is very substantial reason, I think, to believe that were it to happen here, its happening would be part of its happening everywhere. For if the American experiment in freedom and decency were to fail, it is hard to see how Jews anywhere could be safe. I don't believe that annihilation is a plausible prediction for this diaspora community. Well, if not annihilation, then what of assimilation? The Israelis have lately developed a rather irritating habit of enthusiastically exaggerating every weakness of our own community, and there are many, in order presumably to prove that Zionist theory remains intact, at least in this regard. We are intermarrying and NPGing, that's negative population growth, NPGing ourselves to an early grave. We are dropping away. There is a hemorrhage from Jewish life. And very many American Jews, trapped by the doomsday psychology which afflicts our people, seem equally enthusiastic in their endorsement of every new gloomy prognosis, in their acceptance of every premature notice of the imminent demise of American Jewry. In my judgment, we seem perversely to be choosing to live rather than to die. In my judgment, whatever else may be said of the past decade or two in American Jewish life, its surprising news remains that the community is productive beyond any earlier prediction, vigorous and vital beyond any classic expectation. Those who argue to the contrary persist in thinking the obituary the whole of the newspaper. Now, what these two surprises, the surprise that we feel physically safe and that we are culturally alive, mean is that the argument for Aliyah becomes an argument based not on self-interest, nor even on the greater good of the Jewish people. It becomes an argument on abstract principle. And I have to say, with some degree of hesitation, it's not the sort of thing one delights in speaking out loud, that the argument for Aliyah is an argument which almost no American Jew takes seriously. The fact is that American Jews not only do not go up to the land, the issue of Aliyah is not even on their agenda. With scattered exceptions, all the talk about Aliyah is merely ritualistic. We are at ease in non-Zion. And that, quite plainly, is a profound insult to the classic Zionist understanding and to the current Zionist enterprise. I began by suggesting that the disappointment in the marriage of Israel and American Jewry is a shared disappointment. For our part, we are also disappointed. For while we are prepared at least still to pay lip service to the traditional notion of Israel's centrality, we are, I think, generally disappointed that Israel has not been quite so consistent an inspiration, a model, a lamp unto the nations as once we wished. We had hoped that Israel would demonstrate the courage of our convictions. And although we understand, most of us, and accept and indulge the impediments that have been put before Israel since the day of its birth, its imperfections, the fact that it is the earthly Jerusalem and not the heavenly Jerusalem that is there being built, those facts nonetheless intrude on our fantasies. We have come thereby to feel more often like an indulgent uncle rather than a proud nephew. Yet that, it seems to me, is not the heart of the matter. For the love is still intact, and the strains come less from our learning that Israel has warts than from our own growing self-confidence and the urge towards a more egalitarian marriage to which that self-confidence gives rise. Yes, we grant Israel's centrality, but I think it increasingly clear that we do not imply by that grant, as classic Zionist theory would insist we do, that because Israel is central, we are peripheral. On the contrary, it seems to me that a growing number of American Jews, including especially those most deeply devoted to the Jewish commonweal, simply do not leap from the premise of Israel's centrality to the conclusion of American Jewry's peripherality. Yes, we say Israel is the center, but yes, as well, America is a center. Our role goes beyond serving as a backstage crew for the essential Jewish action, which takes place exclusively on the Israeli stage. There is a new sense of self-worth in American Jewish life. There is a new sense of the possibility of American Jewish life, and the American Jewish community cannot be centrally informed by a theory which relegates it to second-class status. This is an issue of which it is somewhat awkward to speak. Given Israel's travails, given the injuries to which Israel is daily exposed, there is a natural reluctance to add insults to Israel's burden. And it might well be thought an insult to assert, for us to assert, that the drama of Israel is anything less than the preeminent Jewish drama of our time. It might well be thought a piece of self-promoting and self-deceiving nonsense to suggest that the creaky and confused contortions of American Jewry have an inherent validity and drama all their own. Israel is, after all, the Israel of Entebbe. We are the Jewry of 3080 Broadway. Israel is Degania and Afikim. We are the Fontainebleau and Grossingers. In Israel, meaning is intrinsic. Here it must self-consciously be pursued. The point I want to make is not that Zionism is wrong in its insistence on the priority which attaches to Israel, or that we are wrong in our refusal to acknowledge that priority in the only meaningful way one can. I mean instead to argue quite simply that the new sense of self-respect which is developing among American Jews, whether it is right or wrong in theory, is healthy in fact. No community can long survive that accepts its own illegitimacy as an organizing premise of its life. The notion that there are real possibilities to an American Jewish life in this country may prove a fiction, but it is more than a convenient fiction. It is an essential fiction. Were the classic Zionists to prove conclusively that it can never be more than a fiction, we would not, I fear, in our largest numbers, pack our bags and head eastward. We would drop out of Jewish life completely. That, it seems to me, is what the trouble in the marriage is all about. We have come to the marriage with different expectations, and we have grown in different ways. We do not easily recognize each other any longer, and we have spent so much time using one another that it is hard and painful for us to perceive each other in non-exploitive ways. And we here are coming to this recognition precisely at a time when we are unable any longer to ignore the ways in which the Israel that is as different from the Israel the Zionists intended as our diaspora is different from the diaspora the Zionists expected. It is not possible to expect a self-respecting Jewish community, a community with a healthy sense of its own validity and of its own competence, to accept uncritically whatever it is the Israelis do. No thoughtful Jewish community, now that Israel and the problems of the Middle East have become global problems, can be expected to refrain from full participation in the global debate over Israel's actions and intentions. In that debate, the Israelis have every right to expect that we shall be especially vigorous allies, that we shall pay sensitive attention to Israel's own definition of its interests, that we shall refrain as best we can from offering aid to Israel's enemies. The Israelis cannot, however, expect that we shall be parrots. The same debate over the wisdom of Israel's policies, which so engrosses Israelis themselves, cannot leave us untouched. Nor can we be expected to be effective champions of the ephemeral policies of this dominant cabinet faction or that. I find the continuing debate over the legitimacy or the wisdom or the propriety of dissent a terrible bore. I'm delighted that Professor Gottheil agrees, because it seems to me plain that unless we allow for dissent within our community, we merely ensure that those who are of a mind to dissent will walk away from that community. There are those who would call such as would walk away summer soldiers. My own view is that the litmus test is not whether a person holds his tongue or not, but whether in his speech he makes it clear that Israel's safety is his axiomatic point of departure. What the opponents of dissent typically do not see, or seeing conveniently refuse to acknowledge, is that the critics of Israel's policies these days argue from precisely the same premise. That is, from the premise that Israel's safety must be enhanced. I'm sure we'll get back to that. But I want to say that while the issues of dissent have for the time being emerged as a major issue in Jewish life and a major bone of contention between ourselves and the Israelis, I don't think them especially important or even interesting issues over the long run. We will say inevitably what we feel we must say, and the Israelis will do inevitably what they feel they must do. And there's bound to be argument between us, and the most we can hope for is that the argument be kept civil and substantive. In the long run, I think it is not the current political argument that will determine the nature of our partnership with the Israelis. In the long run, the issues are centrally cultural rather than political. In the long run, the question, the burning question, the urgent question, the critical question, the inescapable question, is whether our children will acknowledge their kinship with the Israelis. In the long run, the issue is whether the arguments that take place are arguments between partners or arguments between strangers. And for all that the behavior of the current Israeli leadership is, in my view, an estranging behavior, the central issues, and therefore our central focus, cannot be with that behavior, but must be with the forms we develop for the assurance that the partnership this generation of Israel and American Jews feels, despite all the stresses and all the strains, will be our legacy to the next generation. That question will be influenced far more by the intimacy of our interaction with Israel on a whole variety of fronts than it will be by an ephemeral difference of political opinion. That question will be determined by the nature and quality of Jewish education, both here and in Israel, by our success in transmitting a shared knowledge of our history, and centrally by our success in crafting a shared understanding of the purpose of the Jewish people.
I am in an uncomfortable position as a moderator. A moderator is supposed to moderate the conflict between the parties that are discussing things, and rather I find myself in the position of an exacerbator. That is, label Leonard Fine spoke at the level of theory, and at the level of theory I disagree with him very strongly. Fred Gottheil spoke at the level of practice, and at the level of practice I disagree with him very strongly. Let me take the prerogative of an exacerbator and say one or two things about this disagreement, and then allow our two speakers to address each other, and then turn it over to you in the audience. Leonard Fine speaks about the death of the Zionism of illusion. That is the notion of Israel as the safest haven, the only safe haven, the notion of Israel as an ideal society, the notion of Israel as bringing an end to all other kinds of Jewish existence, that this Zionism of illusion has passed, and that we should recognize its passing. In this, one cannot disagree, but one can strongly disagree with the notion that this is the only kind of Zionism that is possible. Indeed, I would say quite strongly that if we look at the growth in Jewish identification among certain segments of American Jewry, that growth is very much involved with identification with Israel. There is no Jewish establishment as well organized and as highly supported as the UJA. And there has been no Jewish opposition as tough, dedicated, and hated as the Jewish opposition of Brera. In other words, much of the revival among Jews in America is precisely linked to the question of Israel, whether out of love, out of anger, or out of a combination of them. It seems to me this is true also of Aliyah. Aliyah may be a dead issue insofar as the illusion of Aliyah was that this was the place of going to an already ideal society, a place which was the safest place for a Jew to be, and not the dangerous place that Israel has become given the situation in the world. But it seems to me that the very revival among certain segments, small as they are, among American Jews, about the need for greater Jewish community, the need for a more total Jewish involvement, will lead to another problem, which is the strain towards sovereignty. The extent to which people, when they begin to become involved in politics, want eventually to be involved in the real politics. When they become involved in education and cultural change, want to be able to administer and bring about that change for their people. And so, what I see is that the Zionism of illusion may have passed, but maybe we're going to see an emergence of a different kind of Zionism in the future. The question is not a question of egalitarianism between two communities, but the question of the strain of the Jewish people towards fuller expression, and that fuller expression is going to inevitably, it seems to me, lead to a problem for many of the most involved Jews as to how to express that in a way different from that of nationalisms of every other people that has emerged in the 19th and 20th century. But in the level of practice, I find great difficulties with the ideas of Fred Gottheil. He points out to us that the strain of American policy that seems to be most dominant is a move towards a very frank American economic imperialism about the Persian Gulf. And I use that word in this audience quite advisedly. That is that American policy vis-a-vis the Middle East should be based on a frank and open acknowledgement that the one central issue for the United States is oil policy and the access to oil and energy in the Middle East. And therefore that the primary target of American policy is the conclusion of a safe passage for Saudi Arabia as the great gas station in the sky. What does he propose as an alternative to this strand of American policy? Does he propose a policy that, in fact, America could live with in any way? It seems to me he does not, and he does not because he refuses to recognize that the only possible alternative for the United States would be a policy which would make it possible for Egypt to emerge as successful in its negotiations with Israel. And it is precisely the kinds of actions that he advocates on behalf of Israel, of the Israeli government, not on behalf of the Israeli people. We know by now that this is not by any means a universal policy. He advocates a policy which would precisely, and again, makes it difficult and even impossible for those negotiations to succeed and to be seen to succeed in the Arab world as an alternative to a Saudi-centric American policy. he tends to avoid the critical issue, it seems to me, that one American policy in the Middle East can only be replaced by another one which is more successful in seeming to advance the interests of peace and stability in the region. And a policy which does not involve a frank acknowledgement of the Israeli role in bringing that about, it seems to me, only guarantees that the policy of Saudi centrism in the United States will become predominant as the fear of the breakdown of the American access to oil in the Middle East becomes more and more predominant in the American public media. So much for my exacerbation. I would now like to ask the two speakers to address themselves to each other, and insofar as they wish to my uncalled for comments.
Mr. Moderator, I'm amazed how a person who could be so perceptive in his criticism, Professor Fine, could be so misguided in his criticism of me. However, I think you are right on the question of what I consider to be Professor Fine's forced dichotomy on the issue of Israel and, as he put it, the self-respect and self-validity for American Jews. Because I think, as you said, and should be underscored, that our own self-respect is much related to our association with Israel, and that wasn't recognized in your talk. I also think that it's not a question of misunderstanding Zionism. Everyone who is a Zionist or non-Zionist has his own interpretation. Good Lord, that's what a lot of the problem's about, our interpretation of what Zionism is. Mine is the following, which discredits much of what you said. It isn't so much that every Jew should be there. That's my personal problem. But Israel gives us the right to choose, and that's what Zionism means to me. The law of return says a Jew has a right to come home. It doesn't say that you're not a Jew if you don't come home. That could be Zionist arguments in Zionist meetings. But Zionism as a concept, as a philosophy, as a way of thinking of a Jew in Israel is my right to choose. At last, I have a right to choose. Before the existence of Israel, there was no right, and no country gave me that security. I could live here and die here, but on my deathbed, I will know I had a right to go to Israel, and to a person in the diaspora, that is a very important meaning to me of Zionism. And I could be a Zionist. Many Israelis may disagree, but I could be a Zionist and stay here believing that my association, my bond with Israel, is that right, which is my heritage. And so drawing that dichotomy, I don't think is fair. To say that the present environment rebukes the Zionist theory, I think is inappropriate. Also, to hold up Israel as a model is much overworked. I suspect that when we read, and certainly in our Sunday schools, we try to encourage this, a model, an appreciation, an acceptance of those things fine and virtuous about an Israeli state. We do that about the American state. That's the Bill of Rights, which most people, if they were given on a piece of paper, would be afraid to sign. But these are things that are great. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. You're not going to deny America the right to believe that its country is founded on things pure and simple, for simple approaches to the problem. But no one, I don't believe anyone in this audience, any sophisticated audience, wouldn't have understood that the Israeli model isn't the model of, as you said, the kibbutzim as opposed to Miami Beach. It's, I think, frankly, it's almost an insult in terms of understanding this relationship. When I studied and worked in Israel, and lived in Jerusalem. I was there when they began the construction of Kiryat Wolfson and the Hilton Hotel. And I was there among people who were saying, you're destroying the landscape of beautiful Jerusalem. And a lot of people, colleagues of mine at Hebrew University, were very upset. But they lived in Jerusalem. And if I were to teach at Hebrew University, or if American Jews decided they'd like to go to Israel and chose Jerusalem, I offer you an alternative. What do we do? Is Jerusalem going to be a museum, a romantic image like we look at the lithographs of Roberts? Or is it a viable, thriving, modern society filled with Jews? And if it is, then I offer the only option will be high-rises, as you have them on Manhattan and anywhere else in this world. And I see Jerusalem as being a city of Jews, modern Jews, and there's no reason why we have to create that dichotomy and to romanticize it as the model of things we thought were nice. People singing songs on the kibbutz is an unfair way of appreciating a modern marriage between Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora. And now to another serious point that the moderator made, and argues that I exacerbate the problem. I'm sure I do in your mind. See? I'm not so sure I do in the mind of Anwar Sadat. That's the important person. Not Begin, not you, not I, but Sadat. And I will offer again the argument that when Mr. Sadat sits down with Mr. Begin to discuss peace in the Middle East, they look to each other in terms of realpolitik, stability, validity of purpose, self-interest. And I don't believe that Egypt would have come to Jerusalem had it not been in Egypt, now represented by Anwar Sadat, in Egypt's self-interest. There was nothing benevolent in his approach. And there is a coming together, a commonality of interest between Egypt and Israel. I would offer quite the opposite view you take. I would argue that if we pushed hard for autonomy, independence, it probably would frighten Sadat. I'm not so sure Sadat is as eager as you may believe he is to pursue those things you think Egypt wants. I think Egypt and Israel at this time have something in common, and that is to keep muted those forces that can not only create great uneasiness for Israel, but for Egypt as well. Now, I understand when you talk about a Sadat speech and what they're doing now at the table. I would offer that the Egyptians look over their shoulders and they see the same people that the Israelis see over their shoulders, and that's the United States, and that they are playing that same role. I offered this, by the way, as a theory to a chap in the Egyptian embassy, and you may not, he bought it. Yes, he said, I think you're reading us correctly. You talk to Jordanians and ask them, why don't you come out, recognize the existence of Israel? And the response one in the cabinet gave me was, we will not be bitten by the same serpent twice, the PLO. The PLO is alive and well and hurting in that region. It is as much a problem, more so a problem. He said to me, where do you think the guns will be placed first? On the Israeli, he may be wrong, but he said, and I believe he was telling me what he really felt, you think they'll be placed facing Israel or facing Jordan? I think that Jordan would be uneasy to follow the position you take. I don't take a hard line because I'm by nature a hardliner. I'm an awfully soft guy. I argue it's the only way we're going to get peace. And what I'm willing to give up if I were the Prime Minister of Israel may surprise an awful lot of you, but I will say we'll never get there until you begin to understand that they operate in their self-interest and they look upon forces that operate upon them in terms of those political dimensions that you, I don't think, took into your calculus. Thank you.
several observations about the marriage and then some observations about Middle East policy. I don't know what it means to talk about, T.S. Eliot must have known what it meant to talk about choices not exercised. Or was it Robert Frost, paths not taken? I don't know what aesthetic there is to a Zionist theory that talks about a hypothetical choice that Jews in their overwhelming majority fail to make. I encountered last week a terribly distressing statistic. I wouldn't want it quoted because I haven't verified it myself, but it came from a reasonably credible source. And it's a symptom of the continuing madness of the Jewish people, I suppose. Over the last decade, happily, in my view, 20,000 South African Jews, of the 120,000 South African Jews there are, have left South Africa. That's about 75% have gone to places other than Israel and about 25% to Israel. During those same 10 years, 20,000 Israelis have moved from Israel to South Africa to make their homes there. No one celebrates that kind of choice making. And it may be not particularly germane to a discussion of Zionist theory, but a theory which is so universally dishonored in the practice of the Jewish people seems to me to be in need of substantial revision. And I'm not satisfied to say that on our deathbed we will know that we had the luxury of choice all our lives, a luxury which made us feel a little bit better, didn't do a damn thing for the Israelis, and there it was, a nice hypothetical. Now I know, and I agree with Steve, and I agree with you, Fred, that we have benefited enormously at a psychological level from Israel's existence. And I think we're talking now not about Zionism, we're talking about the flesh and blood state of Israel. It's not Zionism that offers you that choice. It is the state of Israel with its apparatus, with its army, with its transportation system, with its schools, with its telephones. It is a country that offers you that right, a particular country in which we invest a great deal of energy and emotion and attention, and properly so. That we derive psychological benefits from that investment, there's no question. I remember, and I shall never forget, that the day after Entebbe, I had to take my car in to be repaired. And I used a Greek mechanic who had his own nondescript garage, and he gave me a ride back to my office in his Mercedes. It's America, like Golden in Medina. And on the way back, he said, you know, you really ought to trade your Fiat in for a Mercedes because you're in the shop all the time with that lousy car of yours. And I said, yeah, you're probably right, but I sort of have this thing about German products. And he said, oh, you must be a Jewish person. And I said, yeah. He said, listen, let me congratulate you on what you did yesterday in Entebbe. And I heard myself saying thank you. I mean, it's really neat. When I was a kid, I was short and fat and wore glasses, you know, and suddenly I was the hero of Entebbe, and it's a marvelous benefit. But I don't know that one builds a marriage out of that. It seems to me, the point of my comments about the idealization and the romanticization was precisely that I think we've passed through that stage. We've passed through the immaturity of an infatuation in which both parties, in which we certainly needed to idealize the Israelis and to imagine literally that after the full day in the fields, in the kibbutzim where they all lived, they really did come back and dance all night. We've passed through that. You know, Bialik once said, the statement has been attributed to a variety of people, I think it really was Bialik, who said that he looked forward to a day when there would be in Palestine a Jewish jail with a Jewish guard on the outside and a Jewish prisoner on the inside. And it was wonderful, that marvelous urge towards the normalization of the Jewish people. Most of us are now aware that the jails in Israel are overcrowded, which is not what Bialik intended, not what we intended, not what the Israelis intended. We have learned that Israel is a very real place. And if we are to relate to it, we have to relate to its reality and not to that myth. Similarly, and let me use the image here that's drawn from Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? I take it that the message of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was that a person who is incapable of loving himself cannot easily love another. A dependent, parasitic American Jewish community, wholly dependent for its sense of self on a Zionist theory that has no empirical correlate and no behavioral mandate, that is dependent on a nation whose culture inevitably is developing in ways this community imperfectly understands, is not a healthy partner to any marriage. The point of my remarks about the growing self-respect of the American Jewish community is that while that self-respect creates very serious problems for the classic Zionist understanding, it holds within itself a promise for a much more mature marriage, much more mature relationship than was possible, it seems to me, 20 years ago in the headier and more romantic days. Now let me move to the policy question very briefly. You say, Fred, that President Sadat did what he did out of self-interest, and I'm sure that's so. And I think precisely the quarrel that I have with you on your interpretation of Israel's policy vis-a-vis the Jordanians and the Palestinians is that I see nothing whatsoever in Israel's statement of intention that provides any inducement either to the Palestinians or to the Jordanians in terms of their own self-interest, in fact, to accept the invitation and to sit down and negotiate at the table. That is to say, I don't know that the Jordanians and Palestinians can be expected to negotiate unless they have a sense that there is a forthcoming answer to the following question put to Mr. Begin. Sir, are there any circumstances, are there any conditions you can define under which the State of Israel would be prepared to relinquish sovereignty over the West Bank? If there are such conditions, then we are prepared to sit and to negotiate and to talk and ultimately to reach such conditions. But if up front you tell us that there are, for all practical purposes, and I stress for all practical purposes, no conditions under which the issue of sovereignty is an issue you are prepared to compromise on, then there is really nothing to talk about. That, it seems to me, is the principal distinction, or one of the two principal distinctions between the so-called hawks and the so-called doves on this issue. The other, and I really would like to know where you stand on this matter, Fred, because you did allude to the fact that were you prime minister under the proper circumstances, you would be ready to give back a lot. My reading of what the Palestinians and Jordanians are saying today is that Fred Gottheil is unfortunately not the prime minister of the State of Israel. And the man who is in fact the prime minister of the State of Israel has given every indication over the course of a very substantial political career that he, in fact, is not prepared to accept the principle of partition. And given that he is not prepared to accept the principle of partition, there is no solution that is possible, and there is no warrant to negotiate.
You want me to?
No, we're going to hold off. I'd like to turn to the audience. Okay, go ahead. If you'd like to identify yourselves, we'd be happy if you did. Paul Kedar, the Israeli Consul General.
I have to leave now, I'm sorry.
was diaspora. The self-respect of American Jewry is benefiting today. This reserved kind of self-respect is creating the world on which every Jew has grown freely over the last 50 years. This thing which has enabled this new rebirth, the renaissance of Jewish dynamic and Jewish creation, creativity, and culture. This is a product of the existence of the State of Israel, which itself is a product of a diaspora which came out of the Holocaust with the strength of creating and giving birth to it. What do I say this? I think that the whole conception of a marriage, which may lead to a divorce, is the wrong concept. I think that Israel is not just the state we can refer to as being somewhere stuck away in the Middle East. I do not even wish it to be the center of life for the American Jew. I say that this is the product of the whole Jewish people. This is the central and the major creative event of the Jewish people's history in the 20th century, not the Holocaust, the creation of Israel. And we are all responsible for it. You here and we there. And this trust we have, because we hold this in trust, is as much a heritage of your grandchildren as of my grandchildren. Having said these one things, I would like to ask you one question.
I thought you were going to call cards. It's all right.
You speak very eloquently of the strength and of the survival of the American Jewish people. I believe that the Jewish people that survived 1800 years of diaspora, having all the time a certain aim to survive. I think that survival in itself cannot be an end in itself. I think that there's a certain sterility in surviving for the sake of survival. My question to you then is, what are you going to survive for?
Take a couple more from the audience.
While I think of an answer.
My name is William Paxton. I'm proud to be one of your sponsors and very happy to be here tonight.
You have a right to speak.
I direct my question to Professor Gottheil. I believe that almost all Israelis share your objective of the peace process, the end objective. However, there is a strong dissenting voice in Israel that the Begin cabinet has the only answer to that process of reaching the ultimate objective. Why the Israelis have the right to dissent, and we Americans must be unified in our stand. I don't understand. You seem to make that a precondition, assuming that you're wrong and that we have an equal right to dissent. But when families fight, we ought to fight within the family. Please help us on how we express our dissent as Israelis express theirs.
This is just a comment. I'm not so sure that events have shown, Mr. Fine, that Zionism, that their theory is wrong.
Do you want to identify yourself?
My name is Leonard Fine. First of all, I agree with you that if the United States, if Jews in America are annihilated, the world just really doesn't go to a worse spot than it is. But even the United States didn't take in Jews from other countries in the 30s. And I'm not at all convinced that given times of economic problems, if Jews in other countries were equally faced with still seems to me to be doing that. I think what happened is, over here, we unduly built up we began to worship Israel and Zionism almost in an idolatrous manner. And I think we've now started to learn that not to overvalue Israel. And I think we're now sobering up.
Is there anyone else who wants to ask on these topics about Leonard's discussion of Zionism? And then we'll give him a chance to answer that. Anyone else who wants to address that issue?
I see 3 hands.
One more, okay.
My name is Bethany Horowitz, and the question I wanted to ask is about, you've been talking about meaning. I mean, the question that was asked, the first question was about the meaning. What can diaspora Jews live for? What do we survive for? I want to know, sort of combining your two approaches, more pragmatic and more meaning-oriented. What new kind of role can American Jewry as Americans? Is there a way that, I guess the way to phrase it would be, is there a way we can convey the meaning that we may come up with to the larger American public that would be productive for Israel and stability and everything?
Okay, this is the last.
My name is Natasha, and I'm on the side of the mother. I'm very worried about the granddaughter. And I want to raise a question on language, and just tell a very short story. I once have seen a film by Leonard Fine, in which there was a couple involved in a love affair with no language. I mean, it was a pure love, they couldn't even speak to each other. So I wonder, we talked about education, what language are we supposed to talk to each other?
Okay. Let me make one thing even more obscure. There's no quarrel, I trust. I have no quarrel with those who hail the achievements of political Zionism. I have nothing in my remarks or in my intentions is meant to derogate in the slightest measure from the extraordinary achievement represented by the State of Israel, by the rebirth of a Hebrew culture, by the creation of a place of refuge. I don't mean to emerge Pollyannishly in a posture that would suggest that were hard times to befall us again, we could count on all manner of door being opened to us. I don't accept that. Israel is a terribly, terribly important place. And I want to make a distinction simply between the State of Israel, the product of political Zionism, and the status of Zionist theory 32 years after the creation of the State of Israel. That's not a terribly heretical thing to do. People in Israel have been talking about that for 32 years as well and trying to come to grips with it. My view of our developing autonomy is that, yes, indeed, we were engaged in a process that I would call not nearly idol worship, but idol worship. Israel filled a terribly important vacuum for us at a very critical point in Jewish history. Israel became Jewish theology at a point when it was very difficult to wrestle with God. And Israel became more than that, or perhaps as part of that, the one cementing fact of Jewish life. Look, UJA is entitled to use the slogan, we are one. Now, we are one is a convenient fiction. I mean, we are not clearly we are not one. Go to Williamsburg, go to Borough Park, and learn how unone we are. Except with respect to this one precious vessel of Jewish life. That is the one cementing fact of Jewish life, no question about it. My sense is that over the course of time, an earlier dependence on Israel for that cement has begun, we're really in the very early stages, to be replaced by a new sense of purpose and of self. Now to Paul Kedar's question, what is that sense of purpose and of self all about? I couldn't agree more that survival for its own sake is an utterly tasteless prescription for a people, for any people, particularly for a people with so productive, so noble a past as ours. And I am distressed at the degree to which the argument for Jewish identification is so often put in terms of survival. If you walk away, then the Jewish people will be in trouble. First of all, it's historically inaccurate. All kinds of Jews have been walking away for many, many centuries, and here we are. Mirza and Duh. And much more important than that, I wonder how practical, how silly an invitation it is when we send out an invitation to young Jews to become part of the Jewish community if on the invitation are engraved the words, "Come survive with us." I mean, really, it is no wonder that so few people RSVP to that kind of an invitation. There has to be a purpose. Incidentally, I think there has to be a purpose defined for the Jewish state beyond the purpose of refuge, though that, given Jewish history, is adequate. I mean, if only that, dayenu. But I think one can and one ought to go beyond that, and I think certainly if one wants to talk in positive terms about Zionism, one is impelled to go beyond that. Zionist theory not only it was the American Zionists who talked about Palestine as a refuge. In Israel, the song was, Anu banu arza livnot ulhibanot ba. We have come to the land to build it and to be rebuilt by it. There was a sense of a new society and a different kind of society. My view is that the ideological cement, not the geographic cement, the ideological cement of the Jewish people is our passionate commitment to a metaphor. You want to talk about language, Natan? To a metaphor that the world is a fractured place and that the Jewish people is implicated in its repair. What we call in Hebrew tikkun olam. That the experiment of the state of Israel is our collective experiment to demonstrate that one can, in fact, create a nation state that is not a hunting state, that is not malignant but is benign, and that's one part of the needed repair, and the Jews in the diaspora, and this I think bears on what you were talking about, Jews in the diaspora are implicated in a different sense in the repair of the universe. I think that joint commitment to Tikkun Olam, after all of the hard work of survival, is finally, if it ever is accomplished, is what connects us and what provides a common language. It is unfortunately a common language which can easily be misunderstood because it is not in fact a language, it is a set of metaphors. But I would propose that educators on both sides of the oceans join forces to teach that language. And I mean educators in the broadest sense of the term and language in the broadest sense of the term. I am sorry to reduce it to a very simple model, but for me it really is in some sense as simple as saying that for both of us, the ancient mandate that holds that we are bound to defend ourselves, if we are not for ourselves, who will be for us, is an urgent contemporary injunction, and it is not less urgent that it's corollary. It is not less urgent in Israel, and it is not less urgent here. That is to say, if we are only for ourselves, what are we? And as confusing as it is to stand at the intersection of those two sentences, The third sentence tells us you've got to somehow make do with that and act now. For me, those are words that describe a historic Jewish mandate, which I think is what this people of ours is all about. And what I would hope does not get lost in the difficult struggle for survival in which we are necessarily forced to engage.
Before I turn to Fred to answer the question about the political side of our discussion, I'd just like to say that for me personally, the question of the Consul General is requires a kind of shehecheyanu, because it reminds me of my first visit to Israel when I was an adolescent, and it was a very important, transforming experience for me. And because we were a Hebrew-speaking group, the Israeli government decided to treat us on the last night in a very special way. And they asked the then speaker of the Knesset, to spend our last evening in Israel with us. And this was a very exciting moment for me, and I went up in Hebrew to the speaker of the Knesset, and I asked him, "What is the philosophy of your government?" And he said to me, philosophy, that's for diaspora. We don't need that here in Israel. So I'm very happy to hear that question asked of diaspora Jews by an Israeli Consul General.
Only in New York.
Are there other people who would like to address the point to Fred Gottheil before I turn it over to him?
Nothing was said about the Russian element in the Near East. It doesn't serve a purpose to have Russian purpose to have peace there. And why do we believe that peace can take place if it doesn't serve the Russian purpose to have peace?
Okay. This is Balfour Brickner.
Resolved in my mind not to say a word. I'm usually pretty good about it. When I hear the pros getting up, I figure, it's an open ball. First of all, that's the imagery of marriage. Let's drop the imagery of marriage. I suppose what we ought to say is that Israel and the American Jewish community they're living together in symbiosis.
It's a good try, man. What do you think, you're a Vorse fan?
I must say, I found some of your remarks got a bit on the trivial side, and I find you sometimes playing softball. And I didn't come to hear either trivia or softball. First of all, you can't really talk seriously about the subject with references to Jerusalem high-rises. There is something in the city of Jerusalem between being a museum on one end and an abomination on the other, and perhaps we haven't found that happy medium. Secondly, I don't think you can really define Zionism in terms of right to choose. That may be your definition today in 1980, but that certainly never was any practical, political definition of Zionism. As a matter of fact, Zionism was built on the whole assumption that there wasn't a right to choose. You had no gray rock. You had no other place to go. As a matter of fact, Zion represented the only hope and the only chance you had. The choice is something of a pro-Israel sentiment that has been articulated since 1948. I think you do yourself the definition of Zionism and the whole argument something of a disservice when you begin glibly to define Zionism as a right to choose. Now as to the critical part. The suggestion, and here you say things that are almost sinister, I think. Because implicit in what you've said is a kind of a fear technique. The suggestion that America is like Germany 1933. And that outside are nothing but enemies. With a hostile administration. That hostility you re-articulated on more than one occasion. Well, I suggest to you that may not be an accurate description of America in 1980. This is not a hostile society. The administration may not be anti-Israel or hostile to Israel, and if it is, I don't think we've made that case at all, particularly in terms of the Egyptian-Israel peace negotiations, and even in and under the alleged duress and pressure of the President
Begin policy of autonomy, as it's being articulated, is not a form of annexation. Where do you distinguish between the Begin policy of autonomy and what some of us might see as just a policy of annexation, giving the Arabs on the West Bank a few token civil controls in terms of when they come and go, and cleaning up the streets and collecting the garbage, maybe not even that, as opposed to real civil autonomy. Second, what do you propose that Israel should do about controlling 1.2 million Arabs who live on the West Bank? Third, what do you conceive as being legitimate Palestinian rights? Are there any Palestinian rights? And how should they be dealt with? I think those are some of the tough questions which all of us in the American Jewish community, whether we live in symbiosis or whether we live in marriage, or whether that is right or wrong, whether we're soft or hard, I think it's soft right now, we're getting harder or tougher. I think those are the kinds of questions with which we are, in the American Jewish community, pretty vitally concerned. I'd like to hear your views on the above.
One last person.
Back there.
Okay.
Like to ask Mr. Brock, where he was in 1967, 1973, where will be next time the war breaks out in Israel? What right has he got to be a broker about lines of 3 million Jews sitting here at 97?
No. Okay.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to give each of the speakers about 5 minutes to.
Someone's life without being invaded upon your protecting
I'm going to give each of the speakers about 5 minutes to end off. I'm going to ask for Fred Gottheil to begin.
Okay. When the second of last speaker, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, but Ricker. I don't think you heard my speech. I never once mentioned Germany. And if you think that I equate American policy with Germany, you are totally mistaken, and you do me a disservice in grossly misrepresenting the position I take. If you cannot distinguish between American policy that is pursuing an interest perceived by the administration and the State Department since Standard of California found commercial oil in the Middle East, if you perceive that policy as identified as the same as a Nazi policy in Germany, that's not my problem of history. But if you think that policy, American policy, doesn't exist, then you have a problem with history, I don't. And I do see it as a very serious problem. I think it colors completely the American position with respect to the Middle East and how the Americans perceive intransigence, stubbornness, and so on. You talk about, do the Palestinians have rights? Of course they have rights. All people have rights, Palestinians too. That's not the question, because I think you forgot a very important thing. Why are the Israelis in the West Bank? When did they get in there? 1953? Did they take buses in 1972? The Israelis are in the West Bank because of 1967. And they went in with tanks, and they were soldiers, and they were aggressed upon. And it may be the problem of the Israeli government, and I think it actually is, for having called the West Bank administered territories or liberated territories. They are occupied territories. They're occupied because we were aggressed upon, and so we occupy, and so we're there. And if there's a problem with Birzeit University, we eliminate that problem in an occupied zone. And if there's a problem with elections of Arab mayors in the West Bank, we first recognize that it's a most unusual occupation where local citizenry can elect those people and print articles and arguments against the occupiers. And if we kept insisting that we're there because we're occupiers, there because of the Six-Day War, there because we were threatened for our existence, and I'm not ashamed to talk about survival issues because I believe they exist. If we were to keep our eye on the important events that led up to the Israeli presence in the West Bank, I don't think you have a problem. Because then I would say, no talk, no rights. I would say, fella, if you aggress upon me and believe that everything is going to be returned in a precondition before I sit down and talk to you, you have to have your head examined. No country ever did that. And to insist that Israel should do it, particularly from a point of morality, is an insult to my intelligence, and I suspect to most people. How can you expect that country, with its geography, to be involved in conditions you're talking about? Human rights for Palestinians? Legitimate national rights? Of course. But there is not going to be any discussion of the legitimate rights of Palestinians until Palestinians accept the legitimate rights of Jews in Israel. Number two, if you're telling me that if a Palestinian in the West Bank took that position, he would have his head blown off, I tell you that's a hell of a lot of information to me. Because then I don't know what you're going to put up in the West Bank. If you're telling me that a moderate Palestinian will have a head blown off, then I'll tell you, you know what I want to see? I want to see an honest-to-goodness resolution within the Palestinian community of that central issue. And when I find that a PLO whacks off someone's head, that there is a reaction and moderates get together and say, listen, we want to exist side by side within Israel, and we're going to establish this politically and oppose the PLO, then I say, we have something cooking. And I don't want quizzling governments. They're not worth anything. I want to see an honest-to-goodness representation of the Palestinians to develop that kind of attitude. And I would argue that Linowitz and others who are part of the Carter administration are not pursuing that direction. And in fact, not because they're evil, it's not the point. The point is that they're pursuing a well-recognized American interest. And the primary focus of an interest, to repeat, lies not in Cairo or in Jerusalem, but in Riyadh. And if you said that I haven't made the position clear, I'll confess that I came for a different purpose and only introduced that parenthetically in 2 minutes. I could go on for 4 weeks on that issue because it is fundamental to where we sit as Jews looking at American policy and looking at how Israel should respond. And when you say, what are the inducements? The inducements, I go back to what I said earlier. The inducements are that if you negotiate with us, we can talk about every issue you want to talk about. And if you say, yeah, well, what about Begin with his long history? It was the same Begin who said he was going to retire in the Sinai, who gave the Sinai completely in exchange for peace with Egypt. And I think then you're prejudging the Begin administration or any administration that comes out of Israel that takes that position. And I think if we had our heads together and understood what the issue is and argued, as every nation state would argue for its own, the Russians in occupied territories, the Americans in Okinawa, how many years were the Americans in Okinawa? And that's not on the border of the United States. I mentioned the Panama as a throwaway, but I could talk for at length at the Panama. And you look at the New York Times over the issues that concern Americans on the issue of Panama and where is Panama and how vital is Panama to the survival of the country. And what we kept insisting as conditions for Panama. And now we say, with really, obviously I'm involved, as we say, take risks. Good God, these people take risks. 4 wars and take risks. Jews may be slow learners, but they learn. 4 wars. We have prior information. If I were the Prime Minister of Israel, as you said, what would you do? I would be very clear on this. I would say, after 4 wars, I have enough information to know that I don't move out of the West Bank, I don't move my occupying force out of the West Bank until I am assured, and I determine whether I'm assured or not.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.